Hello and welcome back to another episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today we have Israel Wayne on. He's a speaker, apologist, a homeschool dad of 11 children. You won't want to miss it. We talk about school choice, school vouchers, and why Christians should be against those and how it spreads Marxism. So you do not want to miss that. And of course, we'll talk about current events, the omnibus bill, and what that means and what the fight over the House speakership was all about. And we'll wrap up with our crypto segment. You won't want to miss this a little bit longer episode than normal, so make sure you have a few extra minutes. Let's jump in.
Classical Conversation Studios presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortins, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today, my guest is Israel Wayne. He is just celebrating 30 years of supporting families, doing Christian apologetics, working full-time in ministry. He's a speaker at many homeschool conventions and at your church. If you want to have him, I would definitely recommend you bring him in. He's written many books. One of the ones that we might touch on today is Education. Does God have an opinion? So Israel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Robert.
So today's episode is going to be a little bit different than normal. We're going to be having a conversation around taxpayer-funded school choice and why both of us believe that that's not something that Christians should advocate for, and homeschoolers definitely shouldn't be advocating for it either. And we want to make the case biblically and historically on why that is so. And so I'd like to really start back, Israel, from the beginning of public education and its proliferation throughout the United States. Why did public schools even get started in the first place in what your research has shown?
Sure. Well, there's kind of two different variations of what are called public schools in American history. You could go back to the colonial era, and you had some of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, like John Adams and Benjamin Rush and a few others, who believed that it was important to promote the idea of schools and local communities. They thought that it was important for a citizenry to be able to read, and particularly for them to be able to read the scriptures. And so you'll read even ordinances that were passed, like Ye Olde Deluder Satan Act, and other similar bills that were passed at state legislatures and such that recognized the importance of education. And so sometimes people refer to those schools as public schools because they were community schools that were open to the public. Any child could attend. But really, they were parent-funded, parent-directed. They were really what we would probably today just call private schools that were open to the public. Some people use the term cottage schools. And so you really had that all the way from the time of the colonial era through the Little House on the Prairie era, pretty much prior to the Civil War. But things changed in 1852 when a Unitarian God-hater named Horace Mann in Massachusetts was able to pass the first compulsory attendance school laws. And that changed the whole dynamic of the schools to where now you didn't have a choice of whether to attend or not to attend. And it also pretty much removed all competition to where the government had a monopoly on schools. And so you were forced to go to these schools. You were forced to pay for it with your tax dollars. And they became what I call government schools. People today still call the schools public schools, but really the more proper terminology would be government schools because they're regulated by the government. They're funded by government tax dollars. All of the standards are set by the government. They're really not controlled by parents. They're not controlled by local communities. They are controlled by government, whether it's state or federal. And so by 1900, you had compulsory attendance laws in every state in the United States, and children were pretty much forced to attend those schools. And The other options came along a little later. In 1925, the Catholics decided that they wanted to opt out and develop their own parochial schools. And so they had Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925. 1972, the Amish were able to opt out and create their own parochial schools through the Yoder versus Wisconsin case. And then in the 70s, you had the growth of Protestant evangelical schools. And then in about 1983, the birth of the modern day homeschooling movement. And so now we have some choice, right?
Yes.
As opposed to a government monopoly. And so that sounds like a good thing. And so it sounds like, as freedom-loving patriots, we should all be about school choice. And yet that term that gets thrown around today of school choice is a bit deceptive. It's a bit misleading.
Yeah, so it's really been a long battle since the beginning of the creation of government schools to have the freedom to choose and direct locally our child's education. But one of the things that I've heard as well about the beginning of the schools is the Protestants wanted people to be able to be integrated into the United States as well as spread the gospel. Like, part of the initial public schooling idea was that it would create stronger Christians and stronger patriots. Is that the case? Is that one of the things that sold the states early on?
I think if you go back to colonial era, yes. When you get to Horace Mann promoted what he called non-sectarian schools. And as a Unitarian, he did not believe in a personal creator God. He did not believe in a God who is still involved in the universe today. He just believed in a kind of ethereal force that started it all and kind of let it go. You know, this spirit of unity, if you will, that abides within all humankind. So he didn't believe in biblical Christianity and was very opposed to it, actually. And one of his intentions in starting the government school system in 1852 was to actually diminish the influence of Christianity in the United States. And so he taught that morals and basic generic versions of Christianity could be taught. Like, you could have Bible reading, but no commentary. No one's sectarian doctrines could be taught one above another. And his view was that over time, we would just create a kind of moral consensus where we just teach generic moral goodness. And then we would all get along and live in some kind of peace and harmony and utopia. And then, of course, the Catholics looked at that and said, well, but we don't want our children to just become general moralists. We want them to become Catholics. And so that's why, 25 years later, they opted out and pushed through the courts to be able to establish their own schools where they could teach their own religious doctrine. The Protestants were really late to coming around to that idea. They just thought, oh, well, our children can get an amoral education at home with no overt religious instruction being taught, maybe just prayers from the Common Book of Prayers and some generic prayers or Bible reading with no sectarian doctrine being pushed. We can teach the doctrine at home, was their view.
Right.
And so we'll be able to give our child our theological bias. All they're teaching in the government schools the public schools, as they called it, is a neutral education religiously, that they're just teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. And really, that misconception, because it's never been that way, because all education is inherently religious and moral. There is no possibility of having religious and moral neutrality in education. So it's never been that way. But that myth has continued today to where people still think that's the case, which in my view is just the height of naivete to believe that the government schools today don't have a religious and moral agenda and that they are only teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. It seems to me like increasingly they don't teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, and they teach everything else.
Sure.
The gender is a fluid concept, and that it's okay for you as a 9-year-old to have a sex change if you want to, and we don't have to tell your parents about it. And CRT and intersectionality and all these other isms. It seems like the government schools are about everything but true academics these days.
Sure. So in your book, Education, Does God Have an Opinion? What did you find in there about whose responsibility it is to educate children? And then I want to talk about, can we really differentiate funding from implementation?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of scriptures actually that speak to education, and that surprises a lot of people when they read my book. They're often shocked because they think the Bible is neutral on education, or that it's more silent, that it doesn't say anything about education. But there are lots of passages that talk about instruction and teaching and training of children. And all of those passages, except for about two in the entire Bible, are directed to parents. So if we think of the institutions that exist on the earth, of the family, the church, the civil government is never commanded to teach children. And interestingly, and this is a great surprise to a lot of people as well, there are actually no commands in the New Testament for the church to teach children either. All the commands that are given on teaching instruction children are given to parents, some specifically to mothers, some specifically to fathers. Ironically, more specific instruction to fathers than to mothers, which is fascinating. But there are a couple of verses where grandparents are commanded by God in a supplementary role to teach their children, where it says, teach your sons and your sons' sons, or teach your children and your children's children. So grandparents have a biblical command not to replace the parents or supplant them, but to come alongside them and teach their grandchildren as well. So we have come to assume that the government is supposed to be teaching and instructing our children. 85% of all evangelicals send their children to the government for education. And then about 8% send them to the church for their academic training, and then various other hybrid models or other versions. But until COVID, only 2% of evangelical Christians sent took responsibility to homeschool their children and teach their children themselves. So 98% of all parents in the United States are not teaching their own children. And yet that's what you find as the model in the scripture.
So, I mean, you and I agree that, and you've been working on it, and we've been working on it, is getting people out of the government school system. And now we have this school choice. And when they mean school choice, it doesn't mean that, hey, you can privately fund a number of ways to send your kids to school: Catholic school, private school, homeschooling, your evangelical schools. But now school choice means the government is going to fund that education. And so why is this not a good thing? Why is the government saying, hey, we know these kids are being taught Marxism in these government schools. We want to help people who don't want their children to be Marxists to pull them out. Why is that bad?
I just read a book a couple of days ago that's actually not even gone to press yet, but I saw a pre-press version of it. And it's written by a public school teacher who is a conservative and a Christian. And it's a good book in a lot of ways, but there was an irony that I saw to it. And this author was saying that the schools are teaching Marxism and they're teaching socialism to your children, which is forced redistribution of wealth. And this is bad. And so what he was saying as a public school teacher is, you as a parent may want to rethink this educational paradigm, because the schools are teaching your children that redistribution of wealth is a good idea, and that we have to have equity where everyone has the same thing, and we do that by force. And he was saying that, of course, this comes out of Marxism, and so this is bad. The irony that I noticed was missing from his book is this author didn't seem to recognize that the system in which he works is inherently socialistic and Marxist in its structure. So regardless of what they teach, the government school system is predicated upon the principle of forced redistribution of wealth. That's what it is. That's the only way that it actually can survive. If you didn't have a mandatory confiscatory taxation system where you are compelled to give to this, with retributions of having your property taken away from you if you don't pay it, the government school system would implode. It would not be able to exist apart from this socialistic Marxist structure that's just inherent within the nature of government schooling itself. And so I think almost no, even educational free choice experts and leaders that I know, almost no one thinks about that
Right.
they're accepting the premise of socialism and forced redistribution of wealth to even advocate for a government school system. So, as I say in my book, Education, Does God Have an Opinion? The primary problem with government schooling is not that it teaches things that are false and dangerous and harmful, although that's hugely problematic. But the
It's a symptom.
fundamental problem with government schools is that they exist. So I actually back up from the discussion and say, where did we even get this concept that we need to take from the haves and redistribute to the have-nots in a kind of educational welfare system? I had a conversation with a guy not long ago who was a Marine, and he told me the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right of all students to free public education. And I was just
Mm,
appalled that he said something like that. And I said, actually, I would encourage you to read the US Constitution because it's a wonderful document and you've actually taken an oath to uphold it. And so you should read it. The 10th Amendment does not speak to education. In fact, the entire US Constitution doesn't mention education, it doesn't
right.
mention schools. Where what you're quoting is actually the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto's 10th plank says that we should have a system of free public schools. That's an inherently Marxist idea. And not to
Right.
go too far afield, but Karl Marx spells out in the Communist Manifesto why he wanted to see public schools established. He said, because we want to destroy the family. And he believed that if you could get children away from their parents, you could destroy the family and religion. And so those were two of his agendas because he believed in order to create a Marxist communist society, you would have to do that. You have to destroy the family and destroy, in particular, Christianity. And so the government school system has been doing that from the beginning. They've been overt about it. It's not like, oh, this is some weird conspiracy. If you read the writings of John Dewey in the 1930s, he said emphatically what their goal was and what their desires were, and they wanted to implement that strategy of turning America into a socialist Marxist nation and eradicating the family. And the very things that the BLM has on their website, or used to, saying this is our agenda, that we want to destroy the traditional family and we want to destroy Christianity. Well, that's always been the agenda of Marxism. And the government schools are an outgrowth of that. So again, I think we have this misguided idea that originally the public school system was Christian, and then somewhere around the 1960s, it started to lose its way. And today it's probably not the best. You have to go back
Right.
and study the history to see that people like Horace Mann and John Dewey were God haters from the beginning, and that they created these schools to destroy Christianity and eventually to create a utopian socialist society. And they've been wildly effective. Let me just throw this in. People say, oh, the public schools today are broken. They're not broken. They're doing exactly what they were created to do. So all the things that you see and you say, oh, they're failing. No, they're not failing. They are succeeding beyond the wildest hopes and dreams of their founders.
Yeah. And a lot of times conservatives or Christians talk about slippery slope, and what they don't think people understand is when the left and the Marxists hear slippery slope, they think the slow march of progress.
Absolutely.
And they oftentimes thinks through centuries, or, when we're wanting to figure out what to do tomorrow. So what you're saying is we can't differentiate the funding from the implementation, that the Marxism that schools are teaching is not something that could be fixed because the whole entire system itself is based on the concept of Karl Marx.
Yeah, so many of my conservative friends want to reform the public school system. And I think from a biblical standpoint, we have to ask ourselves as reformers, what is it that we should be engaged with in the process of reformation? Well, I would say that any institution that God has formed, we have an obligation to reform when it comes to a state of lethargy and decay. So if the church begins to atrophy, we have an obligation to be involved in the process of the reformation of the church. If the family is falling apart, we need to seek to reform the family, but we can only justly reform what God has formed. And there are some institutions that God didn't form, that weren't God's idea. So, things like street gangs and brothels and the pornography industry and opium dens. And, those are not institutions that God formed. So I don't want to reform those institutions. I want to abolish them. Right. So when you think about the government school system, the concept that we need to send our children to the government to have them instructed and taught, and then fund that through stealing from some people who have resources to redistribute to other people, which is inherently Marxist. That none of those ideas come from Scripture. God didn't have anything to do with founding the government school system. And so at the end of the day, the best case scenario, if we reform the government school system, is we have a government school system. We have a Marxist, socialist, forced redistribution government school system, even if the things they teach are slightly more conservative. So inherently, at the end of the day, the best win that we could possibly have is still one I don't want. I don't want there to be a government-controlled education system, because ultimately education is supposed to belong to the parents.
One of the things that said in Matthew 12:25, it says a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. And of course, we also hear the story of when Jesus told the parable of the house being built on sand versus the house being built on a rock. And what I think I hear you saying is that when we build a school system based on the redistribution of wealth, that it is being built on sand, and that if we're conservatives and we're Christians, and we believe in a free market, and we believe that that's going to produce the best outcomes, especially when it's aligned with a biblical worldview, that sending and inviting a government, a Marxist system into our household is now a house that is divided. And, personally, I see that the Bible speaks against that.
Yeah, there's an old book that's called The Medium is the Message. It talks about aesthetics, but the message of a thing is not merely the words. Just like a movie is not just the movie script. There's all these other things that convey the message, whether it be the lighting, the music soundtrack, the acting, the special effects. Like all of that comes together and presents a message. And so I think what we have run into is Christians who think only about the content. They don't think about the vehicle. They don't think about the medium. They don't think about what the form and structure that carries that content. And my view is that education must be thoroughly biblical, not only in its content, but also in its form and its structure, because both of those things are important. God is not a pragmatist, pragmatism meaning that whatever works is right. John Dewey was a pragmatist, but God is not. So God is not someone who says, oh, it doesn't matter how you get there as long as you get there. The ends justifies the means. God has structured the universe in such a way that the method and the practice matters deeply. You can see that all throughout the Old Testament as God talks about worship. And when people thought, well, I can just worship God the way I want to. You see Saul giving a sacrifice when he's not authorized. You see Nadab and Abihu offering strange fire. You see Uzzah reaching out and touching the ark in an irreverent way. And God dealt severely with them because they were not focused on the form of worship. They thought the only thing that matters is content. And so I think when we think about education is discipleship. And it's the passing on of values from one generation to another. And there's just no way that you can ignore God's pattern for the structure, form, and methodology of education, the pedagogy of education, and say all that matters is the words that we teach. Absolutely fallacious, and just simply we'll never get the results that we want when we ignore the structure and pattern that God set up for education as well.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things you always hear about is, education is neutral. Well, for us, it's not. If 2 + 2 = 4 and a base 10 mathematical equation, which is what we use as standard here in the U.S., then that says something about the nature of God. And when, we have this idea that science and religion are opposite each other, you and I don't share that view, but that's created by over 100 years of this idea that education can be devoid of religion. And you mentioned earlier that that's not the case. So thank you for doing that. One of the things that we hear often is, the money should follow the child. What else follows the child besides the money?
Well, here's what's concerning about this, Robert, is that this mantra is being promoted by our right-wing brethren. You
Yes,
expect
they should know better.
you expect bad ideas to come from the left, and you expect socialists to promote socialist ideas. But in this case, we actually have a bad idea that's being promoted from the right. And it sounds good on paper because it sounds like, we already pay our tax money into this system, so we ought to get something back out of it. And sometimes what I say to people, just to help them to kind of wake up a little bit and think this through, I say, well, let's say that, the government says that you can have a free education for your children paid for by your tax dollars, but the only option that you have is that they can attend a local Muslim school. Would you do that? And oftentimes they have to really think about it because it's very tempting for them to say, yeah, I might do that if you said it's free. But on the other hand, they go, well, but I think the ideas that would be taught there would be ones that I would be in opposition to as a Christian. So I don't know that that's a good thing. I don't know if I should send my child to a Muslim school simply because it's free and like I get some kind of a benefit. Like I'm already paying into it, so I might as well. They stop and think about that. The content slows them down a little bit. But when we talk about this forced redistribution of wealth, whatever the government pays for, it controls. And so if the government is sending checks to parents, and there's so many different ways that school choice happens, whether it's through vouchers, whether it's through what's called education savings accounts or ESAs, through charter schools, online charter schools, so many variations of it. But wherever the government money goes, regulations and control from the government follows. And a lot of people say, oh, that's a straw man.
I mean, we want it. If we want good government, we want them to have some oversight of the dollars they spend. Yeah,
I mean, really, anytime that they're spending our money, right, there should be accountability. There should be some kind of regulations that follow how that money is being used. And just to help somebody, again, to think about this, switching the argument around a little bit, putting a different, showing the other side of the coin, a lot of times I'll ask Christians, do you want your tax dollars going to fund Muslim private schools so that they can teach children Islamic jihad, for example? And they usually say, no, I don't want to pay for that with my tax dollars. Well, can you see why atheists might not want their tax dollars going to pay for you giving religious instruction to your children? And they go, well, yeah, but that's different. Inherently, because all education is teaching values, somebody's values are going to be promoted and somebody's values are going to be ignored and trampled. It's just the nature of it. You are going to promote some ideas and suppress other ideas. And so the idea of tax dollars going to promote religious instruction is deeply troubling to a lot of taxpayers who are not religious. They don't like that idea whatsoever. And I think personally, that's not an argument so much against us not funding private schooling as much as not having tax dollars go to education at all. Because if someone is privately paying for a child's education, I think they have the right, and I would support entirely their right to teach their child Wicca, if that's their value system, or Buddhism, or Hinduism, or atheism, or whatever ism they happen to hold to. I'm entirely fine with that until all of a sudden it's my tax money being taken from me by force to promote something that's opposed to my values. Now I have a problem with it. And so this idea of the funding of private Christian education is, that's really at the crux of it, that the government says, well, and we'll have to do a whole separate broadcast on this, but they say, well, it's that alleged separation of First Amendment, wall of separation of church and state. We can't fund religion. which is a whole nother topic. And you can probably, or maybe even have had guests on that can speak to that even better than I could. A lot of misnomers there. But ultimately, this issue is one that anything the government funds, they want to teach their values, and their values are going to trump. And we actually have a couple of cases I'll just speak to real quickly. I just wrote an article for Illinois Family Institute called Hasidic Schools and School Choice. There are these schools in New York that are out of the Jewish community, and these Hasidic schools, they teach religious instruction. They have taken over $1 billion over the last 4 years in government funds. And there's this huge investigation that's just been opened up into their schools. And the government now is saying, we're going to have to come in and severely regulate these schools because we don't know that they're teaching the right kinds of values, and we don't believe they are performing at the right level academically. And so we're going to have to start introducing standardized testing to see if they're on par with our government standards of academics. And then we're going to have to make sure that they're not teaching things that are opposed to our collective values, like the LGBTQ agenda and CRT and so on. There's also the situation in Alberta, Canada, 5 years ago or so, where they shut down private Christian schools who would not conform to their LGBT standards because the private schools there were taking government funds. So there's this argument that's used of, oh, you're just Chicken Little and you're saying the sky is falling and you're crying wolf, that basically that these schools or homeschools are going to be in jeopardy if they take government money. Well, show us evidence of that. Show us where that's happening. I would point to the schools in Alberta, Canada, the Hasidic schools in New York as prime examples in very recent memory of where that's happened exactly. So it's not just a pie in the sky theory. That actually has happened, and it always will happen because of the nature of government funding.
Yeah, I've heard that this private schools in Indiana who've been taking government funds, like the results of those schools have decreased exponentially through the years. And it's really not a surprise, because if the government is involved and it's not something that they ought to be involved in, like the Lord created the world to operate in a certain manner, the government's operating outside of their realm of jurisdiction, it's not going to go well. It's going to be expensive. One of the other things that I think is going to follow the children is dependency and this welfare mindset as well into adulthood. So say that school choice goes relatively well as far as the right's concerned. These kids leave the public school system and they're taught better things. Well, now they're 22, 23 years old. There's UBI, there's single payer healthcare, single payer housing. They might be opposed to it initially, but when someone confronts them, say, hey, your entire education was paid for by taxpayers. If you got that advantage, why shouldn't these individuals get this advantage now? How would you consult? How are you going to push back against that? Because a lot of these think tanks would be, I'm against UBI, I'm against single payer healthcare. Like, these things drive up costs, they decrease value, they're Marxist, but now in my mind, they're promoting an idea that's going to lead to the fruition of these Marxist ideas.
Absolutely. Well,
does that make sense to you?
Yeah. You look at the history of welfare in all of its different varieties, and once the government gets involved in a thing, it's almost impossible to roll it back. I mean, look at the Social Security Administration, where the government started taking care of retirement. People became dependent on it, and it's a failing system. Or you look at healthcare, which is a prime example of once the government got deeply entrenched in the healthcare system, it became far worse, not better. And how would you extract the government tentacles out of healthcare now, right? And so with the government schools, you just see how they even squash competition. I'll give you a quick example. In Michigan, where I live, I'm on the board of the State Homeschool Association. I'm the vice president of a group called Mission, MICHN. And the government here started offering to pay for co-op classes for homeschoolers. So you're still a private homeschooler. You still use whatever curriculum you want. You're not considered a public school student, but you can get free co-op classes through the public school system simply by signing a paper that acknowledges that these courses are paid for with your government tax dollars. And so almost all the homeschoolers in Michigan signed up for it and are still involved in it, even though our Constitution says no public monies can be used for non-public schools. Somehow it's happening, even though it's exclusively or explicitly forbidden in our state constitution. And what it did is it essentially shut down almost all the co-ops in the state of Michigan. There's very few that still exist, because how can you compete with free? It used to be with the private homeschool co-ops in Michigan that you either had to pay a small fee to the tutor or to be part of the class, or you had to volunteer. And homeschoolers say, but it's so much easier to not have to volunteer or to not pay because it's already paid for by my tax dollars. Now, the insidious part of it is on the back end. What the local public school district does is sends a bill to the state, calls your student on the side a part-time public school student, and gets 85% of the funding for your child for the whole year if they take like a music class and an art class. So they're getting like $9,000 a year for your kid taking a couple of classes. So it's a huge additional tax burden for the state. But what's happened is the co-ops that were formerly Christian, that were formerly private, have started shrinking because they simply can't compete with this government system. So interestingly, just a program like that, the government once again is reducing competition, bringing everything kind of back under government control. And we don't see right now a lot of regulation, but there was a homeschool co-op meeting in a church that was taking government funds. The students were, it's the money following the student, not going to the co-op, but going to the students. And a government school official showed up at their church, at their co-op, and observed. And they had a prayer time during the co-op. And this government school official said, you cannot pray during this class time because this class was funded by the local public school district, and we have a separation of school and state, or school and church and state rather. And so they were told by a government official, you cannot pray in your homeschool co-op because this is government funded. So we're seeing it happen. And the idea that, people say, we'll back out. If they start putting regulations or restrictions or telling us we have to teach things that we don't agree with, we'll just back out of the system. I've not seen that happen. In fact, that very co-op said previously, well, if that ever happens, if we ever get regulated, we'll just back out of the system. What did they do? They didn't back out of the system. They just said, well, we just won't pray during class time. We'll pray some other time. So your point is exactly on point, that once people become dependent upon the money, they don't know how to extract themselves out of it. It's almost impossible.
I feel like Jesus said something about if you deny me in front of government officials, I'll deny you. But I don't know. Very
true. And he said, you're either for me or you're against me. And so we have this allegiance, right? And it's like, hey, for a little bit of money, will you deny Jesus and not acknowledge? You think about Proverbs, I think it's 3, 5, and 6, where it says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all of your ways, acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Well, that's our academic ways as well. We have to acknowledge that he's the creator of math. He's the creator of science and biology and all these things that we're studying. If we can't acknowledge him in the class time, because then we won't get our government bucks, something's endemically wrong with that. And so I appreciate your willingness to bring this up and to give us the opportunity to throw some ideas out there that I know people haven't probably thought of, or at least not deeply. I know it's hard to shift your mind in a 30-minute podcast and say, I'm going to think totally different about this. But I've written about this fairly extensively. I have also a book called Answers for Homeschooling, Top 25 Questions Critics Ask. I've written about it in there, as well as Education, Does God Have an Opinion? I write about it in different ways in both books. So if somebody wants to think about it more deeply, I know you have a lot of resources on it, but I would encourage them to check out my books on that as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We're probably over our normal amount of time. I just want to leave a couple of different thoughts. One, didn't Judas deny God for a few shekels?
That's right. That's right.
Two, Jesus said, they're asking him, if the Romans make us walk 1 mile, what should we do? And obviously that's forcing them to do something that they didn't want to do. I kind of relate that to taxation. You have your time. Taxation is taking some of your time away from them. Jesus said, we'll walk a second mile. So I think as homeschoolers, not only do we pay for our government school system, but we walk a second mile by paying our own way for our own children. And that's a way of honoring God. And
we do,
third thing.
Can I say something on that too, Robert?
Yep, go for it.
An additional thought on that is in most of these cases, we're adding an additional tax burden when we sign up for school choice for private schools and homeschool. It's not just, we're getting some of our money back. We're creating a substantially larger tax burden for our neighbors for them to pay for our child's education. Like I said, this homeschool co-op, if you have your kid in art and music, you're costing your neighbors $8,500 to $9,000 per child per year additional tax burden for your kid to have 2 free classes. That's not just you getting something back for your taxes. Most people don't pay that much in property tax a year, right. And so if they have 4 children involved in that process, they're $35,000, $40,000 of extra tax burden that they're causing. So I just want to jump in and throw that out there because, again, that idea of, I should get something back for my funds. No, you're actually creating an additional tax burden as well in almost every case.
Yeah, they're almost always getting, especially like in Arizona, the one that the right is saying is a good thing is like almost nobody's paying that much in taxes.
That's
so
right.
It's just welfare and you're normalizing it for your own family. The final thing I wanted to remind people of, the Supreme Court had 2 different cases in front of them with the COVID vaccine mandate. One of them was for big businesses, which got struck down. The other one was for hospitals. And the reason that they upheld it was because hospitals were taking government money. And if the government, through Medicaid and Medicare, is now the customer, they can tell you how to run your business. And so you can take that same logic and say, hey, if you're taking state money, now the state can tell you how to run your business. And so I think it's more than a slippery slope. To me, it could be the end of the republic, the end of fighting against Marxism if we have both major parties embracing Marxist educational funding policies. So that's why I'm passionate about it. That's why I'm taking an unpopular position of saying, no, it's not your money. No, the money shouldn't follow the child because I see the end game, and the end game is not something that I think is going to be beneficial to anybody.
I'm grateful for you taking a stand on it. As you say, very few conservatives, I think, have even thought it through enough to see why it's dangerous. And you bring awareness to this is so important. So thank you, Robert.
Israel, thanks for being on the show today. Can you tell people where they can connect with you?
Yes, you can visit me at my website, which is familyrenewal.org. I also would encourage you to visit my blog, which is christianworldview.net, christianworldview.net/blog. And so familyrenewal.org, there's a store there where you can purchase my books and materials, and then christianworldview.net.
All right. Thank you so much for coming today. And check out Israel Wayne. And I love all the work that he does. And if he's ever a speaker near you, go check him out. All right. Let's practice our 15 tools of learning together by discussing a current event. 2 events that happened over the last couple months that we want to look back on is the omnibus bill that passed with bipartisan support through the House and Senate during the lame duck session, as well as the speaker fight in the House for the GOP. We're going to practice with the 15 tools of learning. So the 5 core habits of grammar is naming, so knowing appropriate word. And the reason it was called an omnibus bill was because it was everything thrown together. It wasn't saying, hey, is this good? Should we fund this idea? Should we fund that idea? It was basically what everybody wanted for their own special pet projects and thrown into one big bill called the omnibus bill. And since each person who voted on it could say they brought something back to their voters, they all voted on it. And it was $1.7 trillion, which is humongous. Obviously, it's going to drive inflation higher. But this was one of the reasons that there was the House fight for the GOP leader. But let's go through the omnibus first. 5 common topics of dialectic. I talked a little bit about comparison. comparing what an omnibus bill is versus funding of individual ideas and inside the government. And then the 5 canons of rhetoric with delivery, practicing the best thoughts, presenting those. Of course, they decided to deliver this in the lame duck session, which allowed people who might not normally vote for it, who were no longer going to be serving, to vote for it, which made it easier to pass. Also, it makes it so that it's not tied into the new Congress. So it's tied with the 117th Congress instead of the 118th. So it kind of wipes hands clean for the 118th because they can say, oh, those idiots in the 117th did it. So then there was this big house fight on the floor. And really that was around rules. It wasn't so much about Kevin McCarthy being Speaker of the House, but around the rules that is going to govern the House. And so the Freedom Caucus, members of it, about 20 of the 30 or 40 members of the Freedom Caucus decided to stop Kevin McCarthy from being the Speaker of the House until they got a rules package that they could agree on. And so things like the omnibus bill would not be able to be in it. So, there's a lot of name calling and different things going on, but the 5 core habits of grammar that you need to really understand is attending for that fight and really differentiating from the speaker gavel and who held that versus the rules package that was really what they were fighting for. And eventually, after I think 15 votes, they got a package that they could live with. We would want to compare this rules package versus previous rules packages to see if we think that's something that was good, such as having 72 hours to read a bill before it could be voted on versus being able to vote on it immediately, forcing members of the House to be present to vote versus proxy, as well as having House committees that have power to actually go where the investigation goes versus a very narrowly defined one where you can have a dog and pony show, make some supporters happy, make your non-supporters not happy and have a nice little segment on the news, but not actually having anything get done. So the Freedom Caucus was tired of that happening. So they fought for a stronger church-like committee, which is named after a man of the last name of Church who used to be in Congress. And then in the 5 canons of rhetoric, we'd want to talk about memory. And of course, they said that this was unprecedented and this was, crazy and all these words during this floor fight and 15 votes. But it actually was not. This is only the, I think, 5th or 6th longest or most votes in history. Used to be very common to happen year in and year out. It's been rare the last 100 years, but part of that is that if there wasn't an agreed upon speaker or rules package beforehand, the person who was leading stepped aside so that someone else who could, get voted in on the first vote could happen. That wasn't in the cards this time, but it is important as classicalists to know our history. So a little bit about the omnibus bill and why that helped lead to the floor fight and making sure a rules package got passed for this upcoming Congress. So that's our current event and practicing the 15 tools of learning together. Up next, we'll wrap up with our segment on crypto. But before that, a short message about our master's program at Classical Conversations. What if I told you you can homeschool your child with Classical Conversations and earn your master's degree all at the same time? We know the hard work parents are putting in, and we thought you should get the recognition for that. And so we have partnered in a unique way with Southeastern University to develop a Master's of Arts program through our Classical Conversations Plus system. So you can earn your master's degree just by educating your student through the upper levels of the Classical Conversations Challenge program. You can earn a Master's of Arts in Classical Studies. This unique opportunity affirms the hard work of homeschooling parents and the education of 2 generations. To learn more about this opportunity, you can visit classicalconversations.com/master. That's classicalconversations.com/master to learn more today. Now to Classical Crypto.
Welcome to Classical Crypto with Will. Wow. Well, we have to kick off the year by talking about the FTX collapse. This is something that just about everyone I've talked to has heard of. And today I want to perhaps help you understand it a little bit deeper, especially if you haven't dug into the story that much. Let's just say that this story and the events that have occurred around it sent shockwaves through not only the crypto community, but the global financial system as a whole. FTX was a crypto exchange started in 2019 by Sam Bankman-Fried, or SBF as many called him. The media commonly referred to him as the Warren Buffett of crypto, which is quite the title. After FTX's launch, it quickly gained popularity in the crypto community for its high trading volumes, innovative products, and low fees. In 2020, FTX became one of the largest crypto derivative exchanges in the world with a daily trading volume of over $1 billion, which is really insane. However, FTX's rapid growth also attracted scrutiny from regulators and critics who claimed that the exchange's business practices were questionable even from the beginning. In November 2020, FTX was hit with a class action lawsuit that accused the company of insider trading and market manipulation. The case was eventually dismissed, but the lawsuit contributed to the negative sentiment surrounding the exchange. So in a way, SBF had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. And in late 2020, Sam Bankman-Fried went on more of a kind of a vocal rampage of the crypto industry as a whole, which was weird because he was a part of it. But he specifically took aim at decentralized exchanges and accused them of facilitating wash trading and other fraudulent activities. This led to backlash from the crypto community, and they came back to Sam Bankman-Fried and just were like, dude, what are you doing? You're hypocritical, given that you have similar or the same accusations leveled against you. So it's very interesting. So there was coming into the summer of 2022, already some negative sentiment surrounding the company. And at this time, the bulk of FTX's assets were stored in their token that they issued, the FTT token. So this is what happened. November 5th, everything was fine for FTX. November 6th, Binance CEO CZ announced that Binance, another rival crypto exchange, was going to start liquidating hundreds of millions of dollars worth of the FTT token. So Binance had and owned a lot of that token, and they sold it off. They just started dumping you could almost say dumping their shares. They were dumping their tokens and exchanging it for other assets. This led to a major sell-off as the crypto community were like, oh, wow, well, if Binance is selling their tokens, maybe I should sell my FTT tokens. And they just started dumping the tokens. Over in the next couple of days, the token, which was sitting at $26 per token, was wiped out. And a week later, by Monday the 14th, the token sat around $1. So on November 6th, if you had $26 in your account, a week later, you had $1 in your account. That's how drastic the sell-off was. In the midst of this process, this mass sell-off, Binance contacted FTX and they flirted with the idea of bailing them out, buying the company. But as they started looking at some of the business practices and the P&L, it was revealed that FTX were tapping into customer funds to fund their own risky bets. This ultimately led to its downfall. Binance had suspected them of doing this, and that's why they started dumping the tokens. But again, let's unpack this. So FBS, Sam Bankman-Fried, was allowing his executives to withdraw billions of dollars worth of customer funds to leverage trade, make risky bets, invest. They were essentially hacking into their own customer base, betraying everyone's trust and playing with their money, which is just absolutely childish. A couple weeks later, Sam Bankman-Fried, he resigned as CEO. FTX became the largest crypto bankruptcy ever filed, and now people are just we're just weeding through the trash, what burned down. The DOJ and SEC are investigating FTX and all its executives. It'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this. I want to say I heard around $15 billion worth of assets were obliterated, evaporated. Customers around the world are outraged. SBF was childish. This was a major error caused by that whole entire team. Really looked bad on the industry, but I'm really glad in one hand that we're weeding out some of these awful players so we can get back on track with crypto as we get closer to the next halving and hopefully get these assets appreciating, heading in the right direction again. So hopefully today's episode gives you a little bit more insight into the whole situation, and we'll see what happens as Sam Bankman-Fried continues to get investigated.
I really believe that this is an episode that your friends are going to need to hear, because the left is not going to talk about school choice in a paradigm that Christians agree with. And the right isn't either, in my opinion, and in Israel's opinion either. So if you enjoyed this, if it made you think a little bit differently about what's going on, please share it with a friend. And we'd love for you to subscribe.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortins. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.